Our first talk today is from Joel Rutman, who brings even a different perspective. This is my kid at my son's wedding, in case you didn't see it yesterday. How's that for a sign? He was married. That's our eldest. Number 3, who's currently spending the year living on the street where I grew up in New Rochelle. And number 4, who'll be here later. And Itai Yerengest, who's out with on a youth group program. He will be here later with his wife, actually. So anyway, so Joel is brings the medical perspective. Oh, I didn't bring my. He's was an MD, I suppose retired, living in Zichron, and was one of the first people who sent me something. So we're happy to have Joel.
Well, firstly, I want to thank everybody who's responsible for this conference. I think this topic is of immense importance, and I think what you're doing is highly commendable, and I'm happy to be a part of it. My wife and I and our family lived in San Antonio, Texas, just down the road from Austin for a long, long time. When I was there, I frequently found myself changing from my talit in the shul as chazan to my white lab coat that I wore on hospital rounds. And what I'd like to do basically is make certain that the same white outfit that suited me in one place suits me in the other place. That's basically my difficulty in my life. One of them. The world of traditional religion pulls me in one direction, whereas the secular approach of modern science pulls me in another. And what I'm going to try and do here is to make sense of these two worlds. A sectarian, a non-believer basically, came and said to Rabbi Akiva, "Who created the world?" This is from a midrash. The Akiva answers, "The Holy One, blessed be He, Kadosh Baruch Hu." He says to him, "Show me proofs." Akiva says, "Just as a house attests to the builder, and the garment to the weaver, and the door to the carpenter, the world attests to the Holy One, blessed be He, that created it." There's no problem. It's obvious. The challenge nowadays, of course, is that the Creator God, known to our ancestors, may have been replaced by natural processes that come about entirely on their own, have a rational explanation, and are without any final purpose. It's a Hefker world. The answer to this is 3 forms. It should be 1, 2, 3 there. One is evolution, schmevolution. And you'll find this approach, I mean, maybe not in this group here, but you'll find it in many places. Don't pay attention to it. Pretty soon it'll be proven false. There's no rhyme or reason to it. God planted the fossils in the earth because He wanted to confuse us, whatever. It's not correct. And I think this approach clearly has nothing to stand on, because day by day, year by year, decade by decade, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. And I'll present some of that today because I think it's required in order to provide a base for what I'm going to talk about later, but also because it's not very well known. It's a difficult topic. Second, mechitza. That is, evolution is correct, but it's separate from Jewish belief. That is, I have one world of belief and one world of science, and the two are separate. And I don't think that works either, because even though Stephen Jay Gould, remember, wrote this book, Non-Overlapping Magisteria, the problem is that they overlap. That is, many of the things that evolutionary science deals with are the same sorts of things that the Jewish tradition deals with. And the third, which is the thing that I obviously am going to talk about, is integration. That is, evolution indeed is true, and it contributes, it adds something to Jewish belief. Rambam, Maimonides, says, there's no way to apprehend Him except it be through the things he has made. So this is in contrast to what somebody was saying yesterday in a quote of Rabbi Sachs, saying that to learn about God from nature is paganism. I don't agree with that at all. I think that knowledge of nature leads to knowledge of God, and that we'll see that. Okay. So your handout shows you that there's two major areas in dealing with evolution. One is evolutionary cosmology, the development of the cosmos, and the other is evolutionary biology, the development of life. We'll talk about cosmology briefly, mainly because I'm not a physicist or a mathematician, and my knowledge is not very deep in this area. Firstly, the medieval Jewish philosophers maintained, as opposed to Aristotle, that the universe had a beginning. Bereshit bara, they translated that as in the beginning, that there was a beginning. And this position is now supported by Big Bang Theory, which says that indeed, some 13.7 billion years ago, there was a beginning. So the rug is pulled out now from Aristotle, and the point goes to our medieval Jewish, Spanish philosophers. The second, Judaism affirms God's unity. Hashem Echad, the Lord is one. And then Hashem, as is known by many people, is a combination of the letters Yud Kei Vav Kei, Yihya, Yihya, Hoveh, Haya. That is, existence is a unity. Lihyot, to be, to exist. Hashem, Yud Hei Vav Hei, is Echad, is a unity. And this idea is similar to Big Bang Theory, which posits that all that exists, energy and matter, shares common origin. Everything, all that exists, has come from, is unified. So those are two big areas in which Jewish belief and cosmology come together. There's a third area, which I'm not going to talk about in a great deal because it's controversial, and which says that we live in a Goldilocks, just right world, whose properties are precisely those needed for carbon-based life to exist. Some people refer to this as the anthropic principle, which is no big deal. It just says that everything is the way it is, because if it wasn't the way it is, we wouldn't be here to say to discuss the issue. So it's a kind of a ridiculous idea. In any event, the cosmic coincidences are things like the gravitational constant, the fine structure constant that enables atoms to exist, the constants that govern the strength of the strong nuclear force in the atom, etc., etc. And there are those who maintain that this is all consistent with a set-up world, with an intended world. You should read, if you're interested in this sort of thing, Paul Davies, a physicist, and John Barrow, who's a professor of mathematics at Oxford, no less. And they're excellent books, and they'll fill you in on this matter. Okay. We'll turn then, after that brief discussion, to Jewish belief in evolutionary biology. That is, Darwin comes along in the mid-19th century, and he describes variation in natural selection, and then finally isolation, which has been used later on as an argument for speciation. Variation simply, we all know that every kid in the family is different. And this comes about because of recombination during the process of cell division and by mutation of the DNA. And those two, the recombination leads to what's called genetic drift, so that populations change over time. And mutation of DNA is what produces real change in organisms. Nature comes along and selects from those organisms that are most fit to survive and reproduce. And this changes populations over time. And then finally, there's isolation. That is, here's a diagram of some sort of animal on both sides, so that when the populations are separated for long enough, and if they are not able to interbreed, then you eventually will have new species. This actually is very nicely demonstrated by a river in Africa, on one side of which are bonobos, which are small chimpanzees with different sexual habits, and on the other side, chimpanzees, which are much larger, and they don't interbreed. And all that separates them is this river. In any event, like a cake recipe which is passed down from one generation to the next generation, with enhancements to the cake in each, the recipe that builds our bodies has been passed down and modified for eons. It's the same recipe, but it's modified and modified. We may not look much like a sea anemone or a jellyfish, but the recipe that builds us is a more intricate version of the one that builds them. Okay, this is I don't know if you can see this too well. See, is there a pointer here?
Yeah,
This bottom thing?
yeah. No, top one.
The top one?
The red?
There it is.
There it is.
Okay, so here, this is vertebrate evolution. So here, it talks about, this is how speciation works. There's a branch off of here that leads to cartilaginous fish, and then there's another branch that leads to bony fish. And here's amphibians, and here's reptiles, and mainly the dinosaurs shown here. And here's birds branching off the same. Here's mammals, and here's a human being. Notice that I haven't put the one on top of the other. The human being here is not at the top. In any event, this is from a cover to a book that I wrote on this subject, and it shows, and the background of it is the same discussion of the origin of species from a bird sheet. Okay, whoops, here. The evidence for evolution we'll just very briefly go through, and I think this is also important because it shows you how solidly this is based. What happens is that the sediments fall to the bottom, and so the most recent times produce sediments that are on the top, and the most ancient ones, sediments are on the bottom. So a human skull, for instance, will be found only at the top. If you happen to find a human skull and sediments that are deposited more than 250,000 years ago, then you'd have trouble with the whole theory, but that just doesn't happen. The evidence comes from embryology. That is, here's the, on the top are the early forms, embryonic forms of all different kinds of vertebrates. On the left here is, on the left here is, doesn't do that, is a fish, and here's a salamander, and here's a turtle, etc., etc., and here's a human being. Now look how different they are at birth, let's say, but look how similar they are earlier on. So that it's like, the quickest way to summarize this has been called ontogeny, that is the development of the individual, repeats the phylogeny, the origin of the entire phylum. Another evidence comes from morphology, that is, this also testifies to descent with modification from common origin. Here you have, why do I have such trouble with this? On the green shows the single bone in the arm. Then you have two bones, the blue and the red, in the forearm. And you have 5 little bones. Then you have, you have a bunch of little bones. Then you have 5 radiating bones. And so each of these vertebrates has the same pattern. You want to make a bat wing, you make the fingers long. You make a horse, you elongate the middle fingers. A frog, you elongate other bones and fuse them together. So it's a playing with a basic structure. And finally, the evolution of life is shown so nicely in modern genetics. On the top is a Drosophila, there's a fruit fly. A fruit fly larva. And on the bottom is a mouse. Fruit fly, think about it. Fruit fly and a mouse, which have nothing in common. But in actuality, they have a tremendous amount in common. That is the genetic program that makes the that determines where the parts of the fruit fly should be placed is the exact genetic program that determines where the parts of the mouth should be, where the eyes should be. And it not only is it the same program, but it's in the exact same order. So it's been passed down for generation after generation and modified. Here's another example. The cytochrome C is a vital enzyme involved in the respiratory system. The structure of this cytochrome is shown on the left and on the right. It's tries to show a three-dimensional. Look, first of all, look how beautiful it is. Look, this is, you think of a protein, you don't think of something that's beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's amazing. And the the structure of that protein is virtually identical in a tuna fish and in rice. Now, can you imagine that? How amazing that is, how they have the commonalities in all of living things. And finally, another evidence from genetics is genomics. That is, every one of these, where it says H on the left is a human and C is a chimpanzee. You could do the same sort of thing with the entire structure now of the genome, but you can't. But I couldn't show that to you very easily on a slide. But look how similar human and the chimpanzee are all along. Chromosome number 2 here is fascinating because in the chimp it's 2 separate chromosomes, whereas in the human the 2 have been combined to give you a single chromosome. So the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Now, let's go with that as a base and turn to some other areas which I think are rather novel, and that is that there are processes that interact with these Darwinian mechanisms to bring about evolutionary progress. And I'll discuss 3 of them: constraints, convergences, and self-organization. It's not that they replace the Darwinian mechanisms of variation, natural selection, and isolation, but they interact. So first is constraints. There are mathematical constraints. Look at here the seeds on the sunflower. They can be described by mathematical formula. Or the chambers on the Nautilus, the same sort of thing, can be described by mathematical formulae. There are mechanical constraints. Thus, when something gets bigger, the surface area doesn't increase as rapidly as the volume. And therefore, a little insect can transpire and change gases through its surface. But a larger organism like ourselves can't do it. There's simply not enough surface area. So we have to develop something called lungs, which basically give us a lot of surface area in which to transpire. It's a mechanical constraint. It has to be that way. Physical chemical bonds, such as in that protein that I showed, that cytochrome C, that's what holds it together. That's what determines its shape. That's what determines protein folding. And finally, genetic constraints. We talked about the Hox genes, and we can talk now about gill slits. That is, the DNA program that makes the gill slits has been retained from our fishy ancestors. Here on the left is the fish, so the purple part is the gill slits. Even though the gill slits serve no function in the human embryo. Why should a human embryo have gill slits? It's simply because the program has been retained from our earlier ancestors and has been now refashioned in us to make the bones of our middle ears, because now we have to hear, because we're on land. We're no longer in the water. So in order to do that, the natural selection has taken over the program that makes gill slits and refashioned it into the middle ear. So I look at all of these as, you might look at them as describe them in a different word, but to me the word that describes them best are constraints. That's just the way the system works. It has to work that way. Okay, convergences. The species have a limited number of ways in which they can adapt to their environment. And therefore, evolution converges on common solutions to the common problems. You need to get around in the air, you have to develop wings. That's just what you have to do. You want to get around in water, you have to get streamlined. You either try to get around in darkness, you could try echolocation. Even blind humans apparently are able to do this. You need to see, you use a camera eye, both in the cephalopods and in the vertebrates. The octopus, for instance. They're the common solutions. This is what you have to do. So the evolutionary system converges on these common solutions. That is, here's the octopus, and here's the vertebrate, that's the us, and you can see how similar they are, even though, look at how different, and from what different origin come an octopus and a human being. And yet we share the same eye, the growth structure of the eye. And finally, self-organization. That is, the carbon atoms will hold hands, if you will, to form fatty acids. Birds and fish will flock together. You see flocks of starlings swooping together by following simple rules. Globules of fat coalesce on their own in grandma's chicken soup. I used to be fascinated by that. See the round little globules. The periodic table of the elements self-organizes according to the rules of quantum mechanics. Crystals form from regularly repeating internal arrangements of atoms. No one tells them what to do, they just do it. Separated retinal cells will organize on their own to reconstitute a retina. Some Japanese group did this. It's amazing. All these things happen on their own. No one's telling them what to do. This is what goes on. Okay, now, we have Darwinian evolution. We have constraints, convergences, self-organization. But then we have a final thing, and that is progress. You fiddle around, this is a quote from somebody that's irrelevant, you fiddle around and you change something, and then you ask, does it improve my survival or not? Okay, that's the variation. If it doesn't, then those individuals die, and that idea goes away. That's the natural selection. But if it does improve survival and reproduction, then those individuals succeed, and you keep fiddling around, improving. So they have the whole system is set up so as to get better over time. Now, some argue that there is no such thing as progress, and there's no yardstick by which to measure it. That is, this was a fight between Gould and O.E. Wilson. Why should intelligence be more important a criterion of progress than smell, where humans are pitifully deficient? What we say we're better than other animals, we're smarter. Well, why is smart more important than smell? Why isn't the dog more higher up on an evolutionary scale than we are, since the dog has better smell than we do? Well, I think most of us would agree that increased complexity means progress, and that humans have progressed compared to bacteria. Okay. An intended world. This is the only important slide. Okay? This is what this whole talk is about. Okay. Constraints, convergences, and self-organization interact with Darwinian mechanisms so as to channel, it's hard to get the right word there, to bring about, if you will, evolution's progress. So I've tried to put three ideas in there. Number one, that the constraints, convergences, and self-organization. Number two, the Darwinian mechanisms. Number three, progress. They're all there's an interaction. And that suggests, although it doesn't prove it, that evolution is set up or intended so as to progress. The system is set up in this way. It's going to progress. Intent is what was meant by the terms Vayas, Vayivra, Vayomer in Genesis 1, according to Sadhya from the 10th century, Babylon. In other words, the intent that is, we say in the morning, Baruch She'amar Vaya Olam. Blessed is he who said, and the world came into being. Okay? Baruch Gozer Makayim. So this is what happened. This is what's going on. Baruch Shamar ve'olam. Blessed is he that said and the world came into being. Blessed is he that had the intent to bring the world into being. The divine, and how does that happen? The divine intent is accomplished via evolution. Evolution is how he brings it about. Evolution is how it's accomplished. Okay, a second way in which intended evolution deepens our understanding of God. Rambam says that embryogenesis is the example of God's kindness, God's chesed. The 13 attributes of God, right? Shlosheh midot. One of them is chesed, kindness. Rambam says that one apprehends the kindness of his governance, his chesed, in the production of the embryos of living beings, the bringing of various faculties to existence in them. That's God's kindness. Can you imagine? So it's directly opposite to Rabbi Sachs's notion. We understand God by understanding embryology of all things. Okay. Another way. The Creator God in the opening parak of Genesis is Elohim, understood by Yehuda Halevi and later by Ramban to be Bal Kochot HaOlam, master of the forces of the universe. What are these forces? Well, they are simply the processes of cosmic and biologic evolution. That's the Kochot. So, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz means when the master of the processes of evolution began to bring heaven and earth into existence. Okay? That's what Elohim is. The forces of existence, of evolution. So our question was whether the universe was created by God or has it evolved on its own? And the answer is a mixture of both. The world has certainly evolved. It has evolved by divine intent, and it has evolved via natural processes. So you're right as usual, and you're right too. Okay. Okay, now, the remaining question is, what is God's intent? What is the point of the whole thing? And so Judaism seems to have had, as far as I can tell, two answers to this. The first is to bring about a tzaddik who will choose to act with righteousness and will strive for holiness. This is the point of the whole project. Others say, Rambam says, it's not ours to know. The world indeed is intended, but we humans cannot know what that intent is. Okay, thank you. That's the end of this talk. There's two more areas that I initially thought I could talk about. One is, why do we still need Bereshit, the opening chapter of Bereshit, if we understand evolution? And the second is, what about moral behavior? How can we say that we still need halakha to teach us moral behavior if moral behavior is an evolved trait? I won't discuss either of those two, but maybe someday in the future. Any questions? Yeah.
Well, is moral behavior an evolved trait?
Well, that's why I won't discuss it, because it would take.
Sure would.
It would take another whole discussion to get into that. But I think the bottom line is, I think it is an evolved trait, but so is immoral behavior. It's just as evolved as moral behavior. And so basically the halakha is needed to differentiate between the two, to steer us towards one and away from the other. Yeah.
In this process of evolution, I would like to know, what do you think about what language comes to be in this process?
You mean how language evolves?
The process is very enhanced by the language. We are able to talk, and written language is very important, but
yes.
Oral language. So
yes.
What do you think about in this process? Language took in this place, what was language in this process?
Oh, how did language evolve?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a whole separate topic. Incidentally, it's prominent topic in Bereshit as well, right? What's the first thing that Adam Rishon does is he names the animals. In other words, speech is the characteristic of the human being. Well, how did human beings evolve language? Well, there are various kinds of utterances in other animals, you know,
They have their own
and which have their own types of language, including sound. And you know, the hyoid bone was discovered in the cave near Zichron, right in the cave. Right, I volunteer on Monday mornings at Ramat HaNadiv in Zichron Yaakov, and a hyoid bone was found in that cave in the Neanderthals, and so the conclusion was that Neanderthals could speak. Well, I mean, they could speak, but did they speak? Well, no one had a tape recorder, so we simply don't know whether they could or not, but possible. Yeah.
Could evolution and all this stuff that happens, could it have happened without God? Is it possible?
Yeah.
In which cases, how is this not a redundant sort of explanation?
Well, here's the thing. The science says that we have another alternate explanation for how the world evolved and came to be the way it is, and therefore we don't need God. But that's just an assumption, right? In other words, I can come up with an explanation of the whole of the natural processes, which includes God, this is what I've done here. And so there's no more reason to say that you have to have God than you don't have to have God. The choice is yours. I've said that this doesn't prove that there is a God, but it is consistent with the fact that there is an intender who has intended this.
But I think that Occam's razor sort of suggests we shouldn't add on hypotheses when they're not needed.
There are those who would say that. However, then you're left with a world without purpose.
But that's an effective
okay.
deal. That's
Then you're left with a world which is, as I said at the beginning, Hefker, it's random. It's a random world. Now, let me get another topic in here, which is this. I think I have it in the slides that are farther on here. Okay, although all that exists reflects at least some degree of intent, outcomes also contain degrees of randomness, okay? There is randomness. Some events in evolution seem to be highly intended, that is, there are bound to be creatures that get about in the air, on land, and in water. One can conceive of that as an intended outcome. There are bound to be creatures of high intelligence. The octopus is highly intelligent. We're highly intelligent. If the whole tape was run again from the beginning, it might be that the octopuses would be sitting here having a conference and not us. But what happened was what happened. Now, there are other events in evolution, however, which seem to be minimally intended. That is, there are hundreds of thousands of species of beetles. I think the bishop there in England, after a talk on evolution back in the 19th century, asked Darwin's bulldog, whatever his name was.
Wallace.
Not Wallace, no.
Huxley.
Huxley, yeah. You know, what does God have to say about the purpose of the universe? And so the answer was he had a liking for beetles. That is, there are over 400,000 species of beetles. Now, does God sit up there trying to decide, I think I'm going to have a 401,000, 402,000 species of beetles? Of course not. What happens is that the system is set up in a certain way, and the beetles, for one reason or other, depending on their genetics, etc., exist in profusion. There are design flaws. We have low back pain. We have wisdom teeth. God doesn't sit, there's no intender that sits about, I think I'm going to make these human beings have terrible problems with because their mandibles have gotten smaller, and so their wisdom teeth no longer have room, so therefore they're going to have trouble with wisdom teeth. In the process of the evolutionary system, these things happen as sort of byproducts. Gould called them spandrels. Spontaneous abortions. That's the same sort of thing. It's not nice to have abortions, but it gets the job done. It's what needs to happen in order for the species to continue. A whale's hind limbs, and here's an example of that. The whale's useless hind limbs are an unintended consequence of an intended system. So here you have in other words, a whale doesn't need feet. So why does it have a program? So why does it have a rudimentary hind limbs? It has rudimentary hind limbs because they're left over from when the whale was a species that was on land. And the program has been retained. So it's an unintended consequence of a system which is intended. So, is there another slide in this series? Beyond that, because the subject is not simple, even the random outcomes, in a sense, are intended. That is, we say in the prayer, "Hamachadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid maseh bereshit," who in his goodness renews daily the work of creation. The renewal is not just a repetition. One can understand renewal as being something new. That is, that the intended evolutionary system requires a degree of randomness so as to evolve new species that can thrive in new environments. And in that way, creation is dynamic. And God, Elohim, is defined as the intent behind evolution's natural processes, is continually active. It's not that he set up the system, on the clock and off it goes, but that the system is constantly changing and evolving. That doesn't answer your question directly, but it answers it indirectly. Yeah.
My sense is, first of all, it's nice that a man of science like you are can go this way. But I think you're misinterpreting Darwin to some extent. I don't think Darwin or the later people who believe in Darwinism, the Dawkins, that whole crowd, they would say that it's all random.
It's all
random.
random, yeah.
And
Right.
intent is not part of Darwinism at all. There is no intent.
No, I didn't. No, I'm not saying that intent is part of Darwinism. What I'm saying is that if you add to Darwinism the constraints, the convergences, and the self-organization, that channels the Darwin, and it is associated,
It works because
and it's associated.
Darwin works. I mean, because the randomness works. Dawkins' concept of the selfish gene that grows in the primal soup. All that stuff is very interesting. I mean, his understanding of anthropology and the ancestors, in his book called An Ancestor's Tale, where he goes through, but not in going from the beginning to today. He goes backwards,
Right.
which I found really an interesting
Right.
way to look at it.
Right.
You dismiss the Goldilocks concept of, that everything here on this planet is perfect, and it is. It works, absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
But today in physics, there's a variety of things called a multiverse.
Yes.
I'm not sure I accept that, except the
Right.
fact that it says that you could have another
Yes.
universe with a different set of parameters, and it would
Yes.
work there as well.
Yes.
And then you don't need intent. You don't need this.
Well,
And
I'm not saying I haven't proved that there is intent. What I've done, I think, is to show that intent is possible. It's a reasonable explanation. If you want to accept it, you can accept it. If you don't want to accept it, you don't have to. But there's nothing in the evolutionary system that rules out an intender.
Right.
Okay?
I mean,
That's all.
I don't know who said it. Paul, you'll have to help me answer who said it. Somebody said, if you can prove, you can accept something without proof, I can dismiss it without proof. And so I love this, because it's very nice. I just give you one example of my own history, and Paul knows this. One of my students was a teacher in a day school in a yeshiva in Long Island. And he invited me to come talk about engineering, which is very much science, and I had a very good time doing that. And of course, when you talk to teenagers, you would know this, Paul, they're smart Alex, all of them,
Yes.
to say the least. And one young man stands up and says, "Dr. Fox, you're wearing a kippah?" how do you believe in evolution and Bereshit? And as he asked this question, the Rosh Yeshiva of the day school walks in. And I figured, I'm either going to burn in hell or something's going to happen. So I looked at him, and I really got very nervous. And I said to him, well, I look at that, and that's what I taught my sons. And I looked at him and I said, look, I look at Bereshit and the stories in the Chumash as moral lessons. And we look at Bereshit and the creation story. It's roughly correct from an evolutionary point of view, but what does it teach us, the 7 days of creation? It teaches us that Shabbat is a day of rest. That's the purpose of the creation story. And while I'm doing that, in the corner of my eye, I'm watching the Rosh Yeshiva, and he smiled, so I knew I had hit the right thing. So the kid sat down, but it's a very hard question.
Yeah, well, on that one, the L'Chadodi, we sing on Friday night, at the end we say, or during the course of it, Sof Maaseh b'Machshavat Achila. It was last in the creation story, but it was first on the idea. So the idea of Bereshit is simply that there is an order in the cosmos, that there's order in life, and that the whole is suffused with holiness and blessing. That's the point of the Bereshit. So that's the details of evolutionary science are not what Bereshit is all about.
Right.
Okay.
Good, thank you.